quote-unquote United fan channel. So thank you very much if you're watching this. This means a lot to me because any single view I get helps massively. So for today's video, the topic is going to be my opinion of what INEOS needs to do to find success at Manchester United 1 year in, right? I think we're all very much in tune with what the situation is as of this recording, which is December 28th, 2024. Things aren't going that well for Amorim and Manchester United. However, I say it's not going well for Amorim. I think it's going perfectly fine for him. Obviously, the results aren't coming, but he himself is definitely not to blame. So without further ado, let's jump into the overall structure of the points that we're going to address, and then we'll dive right in. So we're going to talk about how we got here. What events happened, this shift from a pure Glazer ownership to now a hybrid INEOS ownership, the current situation. We'll touch on it at a very high level. Again, those who are hurting and are in the present know, so I won't beat a dead horse. I think we're all very much in tune, though we might have different opinions of kind of what the problem is or what's going on exactly. And then talking about long-term, mid-term, and long-term. Did I say long-term twice? I said long-term twice. Short-term, mid-term, long-term, excuse me. And kind of what that might look like as a blueprint, if you will, again, from where I'm sitting. So how we got here, right? 2022-23, of course, right? The Glazers announced that they would be selling the club, or open to selling the club, after, of course, mounting pressure from the fans. Many were staging protests, right? There was a lot of activism around the club at the time that really drove the Glazers to take some sort of action. Now, of course, in hindsight, what that action is probably a little bit different than what we were expecting. But effectively, what we were told at the time is there were two front runners in this race. One being Sheikh Jassim, right, from Qatar, and then the second being Sir Jim Ratcliffe from INEOS. I think, from what I recall, there may be another name or two in there, but nothing I think was really sticking. Like, I think Elon Musk at one time was floated, right? But really those were the two that for the longest time journalists and the club seemed to be entertaining. As we all know, again, I won't get too deep into the details, there was a lot of drama around that, right? There was a lot of back and forth about what the Glazers expected. There were different offers coming from both parties, kind of trying to one-up each other. And there were growing concerns and tensions coming from the Qatar side about the process and why it was taking so long. And for those that don't quite remember, INEOS was basically projected to buy a stake in the club, not so much an entire takeover, whereas Qatar was going to take over the club in its entirety, or at least that was their desire. Whether or not that's what the Glazers were willing to do at the time is a different story. I don't quite recall if there's been any sort of article around that. I don't think we've really gotten to the root of what the Glazers were expecting to see from that type of deal. So those were kind of the two different sides of the coin as well that we're taking into consideration. And Qatar, we'll focus on that one first because we'll get to INEOS here in a second. So with Qatar, right, full takeover, basically promised, and of course, right, as we know, people in various walks of life, whether it be politics or anywhere else, especially as like a business owner, might promise something and what they deliver might be something completely different. So all we can talk about are the promises because everything else is whataboutism as to whether or not they would have followed through on it. We just have to say that if in good faith they did follow through and everything, things might have been different. Basically, the two big sticking points for them were that they were going to clear the debt. The club is in massive debt currently. And the second one was going to be building a new stadium almost immediately. Again, there's been a lot of discussion and debate currently about whether or not we should keep Old Trafford. Should we try to rehabilitate it and keep the history, or should we just start from scratch? Qatar seemed to be going the way of just starting from scratch and sacking Old Trafford, if you will. So those are kind of the big 2 points for them. And then on the other side, INEOS didn't really offer too much. Honestly, probably should have done a little bit more research into the history of all this to refresh my own memory. But I don't think there were quite those many promises that were associated with it. I think the big thing at the time from a public stance is that this was shortly on the heels of the Qatar World Cup, right? In all recent history or memory of everything, right? Again, 22, 23 is about when this happened. Of course, we had the 2020 World Cup. So a lot of folks saw what happened in Qatar of how the tournament was built, right, using basically modern day slavery by taking in immigrants who really needed the work and then basically stranding them there by stripping away their passports and their means to travel and leave. I might get canceled for that, but whatever. Anyway, so there was a lot of negative sentiment around Qatar ownership with that in mind, because you just have to question the business practices that then follow with that type of takeover. And so, of course, hindsight is 2020, and you could say what you will now at this point, because there's been, I feel like, a lot of revisionism of people saying, oh, we should have gone with Qatar. But again, I think people are very quick to forget why we didn't, as a fan base, truly want Qatar as a whole, right? I'm pretty sure the majority of the time didn't want that, and we were more in favor of the INEOS approach. With that being said, I don't really think there were any xenophobic takes on it. I don't think that was the narrative whatsoever behind that. You can argue the motives, of course, of certain characters, but I don't think that really had anything to do with it. Again, I think it was more about the practices of the Qatar World Cup and bringing those into question. So then, of course, we go with INEOS, right? All of that is now in the past. And of course, that even took a while to confirm. It felt like an eternity by the time we got that. And it was around this time last year that, of course, INEOS was in place, right? And began their takeover of the club. And when I say takeover, it really isn't takeover, right? They're just taking over the footballing operation, not the actual majority ownership. That leads us into the current situation, right? Won't beat a dead horse again. But in the summer, spent $200 million. Of course, there was the whole Erik ten Hag debate, right? Okay, again, this is all rumored, but there were rumors about if Erik ten Hag didn't win the FA Cup, he was getting sacked. If he won the FA Cup, obviously that brings up a different conversation. And as we know now, with Dan Ashworth being removed from the club, we can only speculate as to what those conversations were, whether or not he was ever safe, or if just the likes of Graham Potter and Gareth Southgate fell through, or that INEOS weren't happy with those decisions and therefore kind of vetoed it. I don't know. It's all speculative as to how that all shook out. But what we do know is that Erik ten Hag did win the FA Cup. There were talks that the club was entertaining interviews with other managers around Europe. I don't know if Amorim was a part of that. Now I can't remember. I feel like there has been maybe some revisionism as to him being approached or wanting to approach him, at least identifying him in the summer, but maybe not approaching him. Obviously, the more serious conversations took place more recently. We'll get into that in a little bit. There was that toss-up. I think that was one of many failures of INEOS up to this point. I think that even though Erik ten Hag wasn't quote-unquote their guy, I think there needs to be some respect for what he did the first year or two. Obviously, a little shaky, some the injury crisis, if you will. Year 3 wasn't going great. But I think as the new owners, you really need to get behind him. And this has been a big sticking point for me, and I've said this multiple times, is that INEOS has been terrible in terms of their communication public-facing. I think their whole cloak and dagger approach for the transfer market and getting deals over the line is great. It ultimately benefits us, right? It's cunning, it's conniving, it's a little cutthroat. We're willing to do the business along with still the top clubs in the world. So that's a positive. But I think in things like the Erik ten Hag conversation, and others, right? It could have been Sancho or Rashford. You don't want them to meddle too much, but I think with the structure that they've put in place of the management, I think there's enough of that. I'm not saying Sir Jim Ratcliffe has to come out and say these things publicly, personally, but I think people like Omar Barada, for example, the CEO, how many times do we see CEO statements from public-owned businesses, right? And Manchester United is traded publicly on the New York Stock Exchange. And therefore, I don't think it's unrealistic to have somebody like your CEO every once in a while, I'm not saying weekly, but every once in a while come out with some sort of statement as to the direction of the club in this type of environment, not even just towards the stakeholders, but towards the media in general. And so I think with their handling of the whole Erik ten Hag situation, that was mismanaged. And I think that when he was under that type of pressure, they really should have backed him, because I think that's where we began to falter, is that you go into the summer with this big question mark around him, players who you could argue were downing tools in their second year, maybe rejoiced, if you will, in this uncertainty, right? Basically saying, oh, we finally did it again to another manager. There's, this cloud, this gray, dark cloud over Erik ten Hag's head. Maybe this is it. Maybe we'll have somebody else in the next season come in. Alas, that was not the case. In the end, INEOS concluded that they couldn't find anybody better. And that's great. That's their prerogative. But so then we enter year 3 with Erik ten Hag. And again, there's still now that element of player power in all of this, where they said, hey, let's try a little harder. And by try a little harder, I mean do all. Basically, we saw piss poor performance after the other, and it's just been shambolic ever since. And I think even since Amram has come in, we haven't really seen too much of a shift in that. We've seen, of course, the idea, the plan, the strategy, the formation, all of that stuff that Amram is bringing. But of course, we're still working on the same players, so what does that really matter? You can make the argument that maybe you just keep Erik ten Hag until the end of the season, but of course, sack Dan Ashworth, you have Omar Barada, basically, and maybe Jason Wilcox leading this whole Amram thing. I don't know if, while Dan Ashworth was still here, if he was ever really pro-Amram or how much his involvement was. I know Amram did speak about him a little bit in his interviews, so obviously he did have some involvement as a director at that point in time. So I don't want to discount him too much, but again, without breaching any sort of NDAs, it's hard to know exactly who spearheaded that and who basically said, go out and get him. It could have been Omar Barada, for all we know, basically saying, I don't care what you want, Dan. I'm the CEO, right? Kind of pulled rank and said, go get me Amarim. Do your job, right? That might have been it as well. Who knows? All speculative. So do we just keep Erik ten Hag until the end of the season and bring in Amarim? No. Instead, he, now as it comes out as of a more recent interview, requested that he stay the rest of the season with Sporting Lisbon and come at the end of the season, with a summer transfer window, with a preseason, all the things that you would expect a manager to have to be successful. But instead, he was brought in November and hasn't had a transfer window, is still working with all the same players, and it's been a mess. Of course, again, this is on the back of spending $200 million in the summer. And so now, as we're approaching January, and Amarim is saying, players like Rashford and Garnacho and arguably Eriksen and Casemiro, many others, aren't good enough. I need fresh new faces that can actually play in my system. Now INEOS is turning around and saying, well, we don't have the money. Again, that's rumored. A lot of this has to do with rumors because we can't just speak directly to the source. We just have to take journalists at their word based on their credibility. So if it's true that we don't have money, where do we go from here? And that's kind of how we got here, current situation, and now sort of my blueprint, if you will, for, I don't remember if I got this wrong or right the first time, the short term, the midterm, and the long term. I think I still said 2 long terms the first time, but that's okay. We'll gloss over that until I bring it up again. So the short term, what do I think needs to happen for the short term to be successful? I think there needs to be a fire sale, and I think INEOS is kind of on the right track of that by saying everybody is for sale. But they said this before, and we didn't really see much movement, right? We saw some outgoings, but not enough. We saw the likes of McTominay and Aaron Wan-Bissaka go, as well as like Martial and Varane just come, to the end of their contracts, right? But like that wasn't an INEOS move. That was just players not being renewed. So There weren't too many outgoings, despite INEOS saying everybody has a price tag. And now I think they need to show that same ruthlessness as they did with Dan Ashworth, if you will, maybe Eric Ten Hag to an example, to a point. And they truly just need to put super low figures on these players and get them out. With the, I guess, big asterisk that clubs are going to have to pay their wages somehow. You know, it's like if you sell Rashford for $2 million, just to be super extreme, will somebody be willing to pay his $350,000 a week? Maybe that's offset, right? I mean, if you say that your valuation of Rashford is 60, 70, 80 million, you know, but somebody's not going to pay 80 million on top of 350,000 a week, but they're willing to pay 40 million with those wages. Great, let them carry that. I don't know. I don't care. I think truly, again, and this is crazy and this is extreme and drastic, but I think this is truly where we are at this point in time. Is the extreme, is the drastic. Just take whatever you can get for him. I don't care if it's 2 million, 5 million, 10 million. Like, I don't care what your personal valuation is of any of these players at this point. They just need to go. Right? And I'm going to pull this up because I'm going to do my own quick math once more as I get into my next point here. Is that really, so go out and sell all these players and then bring in basically an entirely new squad. And so what I mean is take whatever you can get for a lot of these players. Again, Rashford, and this, well, I'll go through the list, my own personal list, if you will. We'll start from the front/top of the pitch and work our way back. And I don't know if I'll really be missing anybody, but let's just riff. Why don't we? Højlund, I think, is safe. I think there's still enough potential there. He's still plenty young. I don't think a lot of the failures that we're seeing on the pitch stem from him. I know there's been a lot of contention around him recently for whatever reason, because player FC is a thing. I don't even know why, but whatever. It is what it is. Yes, does he have room to improve? Of course. But Amram has publicly praised him for working on those weak areas, such as his hold-up play, right? So I think as long as Amram is happy with what he's seeing in Højlund, keep him. I think Amram is great with working with the youth, and so if you keep somebody like Højlund around, he's only going to grow into this role. He's only going to grow in this system as we replace these other players around him, and I think he will thrive. I think he'll come very good. Even right now, his conversion rate is extremely good. There are just other areas of his performance that needs to improve. That's it. Højlund, I think, is safe. Xerxes, still a big question mark. I don't think he's a number 9, even though he gets played there often. As a number 10 in this system, I think his passing at times is okay. I think he's much better at just the kind of quick 1-2s. And when I say quick 1-2s, it's not even so much that he's getting on the end of the other one, but kind of that just quick first touch passing. I think he's okay at. I think his mid to long range ball is lacking. I think pace-wise, he's on the little slower side, and you can make maybe that same argument with Højlund, but I think Højlund compensates in other areas where maybe Xerxes doesn't. So Xerxes, still big question mark. Again, right price, right offer, sell him, I think. Now we'll get into the midfield. Rashford, Garnacho. Rashford, 100%, get him out. I've said this for many years. I'm glad that finally some folks are coming around to it. Amram has seen it as well. I've seen it forever, even since before his last contract extension. When he got a new contract, I was flabbergasted. I don't know how he was handed that, especially on how much he is on now. Rashford, go. Garnacho, apparently, a lot of question marks. We're not there every day. I can only trust Amram's take on all of this. If he is willing to give Garnacho a chance and, has that forgiveness in him, if you will, great, whatever, keep him, do with him what you will. But I also, again, 100% back and trust in Amram. If he says Garnacho goes, Garnacho goes. That's it. I don't care. Bruno, go. Absolutely get him out of here. He's the other player. Bruno and Rashford, 4 years, I've been saying just get them out. They're not the type of player that we need. Rashford doesn't defend. He doesn't have the intensity or aggression. to be on the wing, not even in this system, just in general, in the Premier League in general. He lacks many of the qualities that other people have. He can't beat his players. With Bruno, he lacks a bit of that pace, which I don't really care about. I think a lot of people are bringing up pace recently. I honestly don't care too much about pace, because one thing that people forget too often is that you can pass the ball faster than somebody can run. So pace has something to do with it a little bit, but when you look at some of the biggest names in the game, Pirlo, I don't know, Giggs, Scholes, they were never the fastest players on the pitch. But what they lacked in pace, they compensated or made up for it in accuracy, you know, their short ball, their mid ball, their long ball, right? In their accuracy and their ability to pick out the passes with creativity and, you know, consistency, right? People can argue Bruno creates things or has that ball in him, but it's not consistent whatsoever. And I think that's a big problem is consistency. And so, yeah, Bruno, I don't care if he quote unquote lacks the pace. Defensively though, and you know, we're now in the era where everybody needs a defensive component to them. You know, no matter if they're at the front or the back of the pitch, they need to have the defensive capabilities to put in a decent tackle every now and then. Bruno doesn't have that, in my opinion. He's extremely reckless. He's always been reckless. I think people are now seeing that with this uptick in red cards. But he's always been very rash in his challenges, and he's given away a lot of stupid, easy fouls in dangerous areas throughout the years. And it's cost us. It has truly cost us time and time and time again, because it'll be something like, oh, his effort, it's so good. He just ran 50 yards, put in the tackle. Great, but now he just took them down, got a yellow card, it's outside the box, and they just scored, right? Like, that happens so often with Bruno. So, defensively, terrible. Offensively, also pretty much just as terrible. For too long, and this system, I think, exposes this also a little bit more. For too long, Bruno has been operating in a, like a 4-2, 3-1? Yeah. 4-2-3-1. There we go. That's the formation we used to play. Where he would be. Did I say 4-3-2-1? Kind of. I think 4-2-1-3. I'm sorry. Jeez. Okay. Right. Basically, you have an inverted triangle at the top, if you will, with Bruno sitting as that 10, just behind the front three, if you will. I say inverted triangle. I don't know geometry. That's not really a triangle. It's a triangle if you create more points along, whatever. We'll get into that. Anywho, but he was basically the number 10. Whether or not you believe he is a 10 or not, he operated more or less as a 10, and was the sole link from the back to the front, right? You had the double pivot back behind him, feeding him, and his next pass was always, well, I say this, it wasn't always forward. His passing is terrible. But anyway, in the event it was a forward pass and played somebody in, there's a chance created, right? He's a stats patter. He's always been a stats patter. People have always pointed to his stats out of context, because I swear they don't watch the matches. They just go, oh, he's one of the best at chances created. But he's the only link. When people, you know, compare him to like Salah, Son, Kevin De Bruyne. Like, when you look at those players, they operate in a very functional midfield where they're not the only source of providing the ball to the front, you know, striker or front three or whoever it may be, right? Whatever those systems may be, right? They operated in a midfield that shared that responsibility. So it was never on them exclusively to make that pass. Bruno did that. And this is kind of a deviation. I'm really getting into a tangent here. And I will self-regulate here, because I will go on this forever. Sorry. I felt like I had to defend against my position against Bruno, because again, people are still coming around to it right now, but there's also still a lot of people that defend him. Anyway, whatever. Tangent. Okay. Rashford, Garnacho, go. Xerxes, go. Bruno, go. Who else do we have up there? Mount. I like him. I think he's very talented, but he needs to go. He's just too injury prone. Amad Diallo, keep him. He's been our best player of the season. Yeah, best player of the season. Keep him. Anthony, go. Right. let's see. What's that tally so far? What are we at here? We have Xerxes, Garnacho, Rashford, Bruno, Mount, Anthony. 6. We're up to 6 so far. I'm going to mark that down so I don't forget it. 6. We're up to 6. All right. It's now going to the defense. Shaw needs to go. Absolutely needs to go. Hasn't been really available forever. The fact that he's still on he's Phil Jones 2.0. Fucking disgrace, honestly, that he's collecting the wages he's collecting for doing fuck all. God damn it. I hate him. I don't really hate him as a person, but you know what I mean. I hate that he's our player still after all these years. Sorry, but I just do. Just go waste somebody else's time. No offense. No, take offense actually to that. Anyway, Shaw needs to go. Dalot, I've always been a defender of him. Again, when it was Dalot versus Aaron Wan-Bissaka, can't even say his name. There was always trade-offs between those two. I always rated Dalot over AWB. There we go. But I think also at this point he needs to go. I've always said, though, if Dalot was our weakest player, we would be in a relatively okay position. He's still one of our weakest players, but also there are just so many other players around him that are very weak as well right now, so it doesn't quite work out the way I would usually spin it. But yeah, so Dalot needs to go. So Shaw, Dalot. Martinez, I think, is okay for right now. I think he has a potential to get exposed in the system. I'm hoping that's not the case. I hope that the system, when fleshed out, he has a place in it. I think he has value. Maguire needs to go. 100%. I know he's been played recently, and I think that's just due to availability and rotation, right, with DeLitt being out with illness more recently. That's why we're seeing a resurgence in Maguire. I think he's way too slow on the ball. I think his passing is a little erratic, which isn't always bad. Don't get me wrong. But when I say erratic, I use that very intentionally because I don't want it to be confused with maybe vision or creativity. Because we'll see him at, the middle of the 3 center backs currently, and he'll ping little balls out from the back, but very slowly, which is, again, my big issue with him. And when I mean slowly, I mean in the decision making of how long it takes him to release that ball, and also just the speed at which he releases it. So those two in tandem of slow. And then when I talk about the erratic passing, so we'll do those like kind of 5-yard passes out of the back. I say 5 yards, so probably more like 10, 15, out to the wings, into the midfield, whatever. But then he also has like that 40-yard pass, to the wingers in this system. And it's not bad, but it's usually at the wrong time. It doesn't necessarily break a press when he does it. And then it's usually at a point where the winger has created space for themselves, but everybody has dropped so deep to receive the ball that now when the winger has it and begins to make that progression up the field, whether it be a pass or a run, they don't really have any options. They maybe have Højlund in the middle, but they just have the one. They usually don't have a good cross on them, so all of that's wasted anyway, or they just have to pull it back and recycle the play. We're basically at square one anyway. So that's why I'm saying it's erratic. He has the ability to do it. He just doesn't have the, I don't want to say IQ, but he just lacks the correct timing of when to do it. So, Maguire, Shaw, Dalot, Maguire, Evans, I love him. I want to stop short of calling him a club legend because obviously he left the club at one point in time, went to Leicester, had a great career there within the context of that, and then came back. But a very loyal servant, let's put it that way. And I think massive respect for him coming back and, giving us what he's given us so many times. Arguably, he's one of the most consistent players we have. Just obviously he doesn't play every match, but when he plays, you know what you're going to get from him every single time. He's very solid, and I massively respect him. I would keep him. Like, honestly, I say go keep him. I don't know what his wages are off the top of my head. If there's something reasonable, keep him. I think maybe he lacks a loud voice in the dressing room. I don't know. Never been in the dressing room, so can't tell you what that dynamic is. But I think he's that type of leader or voice that we still need, especially with where I'm going with this. I know this is taking a while, jeez. But I swear we're getting there with the short, mid, and long term. That will kind of wrap up here shortly. This is the meat and taters of it. Anyway, keep Evans. I have to remind myself again. Shaw, Dalot, Maguire. Lindelof, get rid of Lindelof. I don't think he has really a role in the system. And I think that gives us 4 at the back. I feel like I'm missing a defender or 2 that I would debate. I wouldn't even debate De Ligt or Mazraoui or Yoro, right? So those 3 are very much safe. So now we're up to 10. If we're all keeping track. There are 10 players right there I would get rid of. Onana, get him out of here. I don't know why we got rid of De Gea. I've said it for the longest time. I kind of trusted Erik ten Hag a little bit there, thinking that maybe like there was some degree of hope that like, okay, if we're getting rid of De Gea, maybe there's something I don't know about this player. Let's give him time. We've given him, I think, adequate enough time. It's just not there. It's not going to work out. It's not what we need. Too often from a shot stopping perspective, he just fails us. So right there, that's 11. And that's like out of more or less, starting 11. Maybe there are some auxiliary players in there, but out of a starting level, I'm not going to go into like Bayern and things of like squad depth or anything of that nature. So there's 11. There's your 11 that you fire sell immediately. I don't know what you get for them. I'm going to say if they, on average, picked up 20 million each, on average, that's purely average. I mean, that's not taking into account a 40 million sale, right? Or 5 million sale, right? We're just talking about averages here. So that's why I'm using 20 as a very conservative number. I think maybe some of these players we could sell for 20 million. Average. That's $220 million raised right there. I'm using dollars, not pounds or euros. We'll just say dollars. You can convert that to whatever currency you want. 220 right there. And this is where we're going to get into this whole short-term, mid-term thing. We're still in the short term for those who have zoned out, maybe gone into a coma since my rant. Still short term. You sell these players. Fire sell them. Get them out of here. I don't think they have a future. I don't think they're what we need. Let me put it that way. There are still question marks about the ones I didn't list, but I think everybody I've listed, there's no need for them whatsoever. 220 million. You've got that in the bank, right? That'll be paid over the years, but whatever. You have that in sales. So now go out and buy youth. Go out and scout, the B leagues, if you will, of Europe. Maybe it's not the Premier League. Maybe it's not La Liga. Maybe it's the league just below that, right? Championship, Serie B, whatever it may be. I don't know where these players are. Again, I'm not a scout. I don't even have a name for you. That's not my job. If it were my job, I would have all of that for you and it would be much more well-researched. But it's not my job. This is just my blueprint. And I think a blueprint or an idea is something to run with, right? And then again, you just task the people whose job it actually is to execute it to the best of their ability. That's all we're doing here. Just a reminder. 220 million, that's what you have. Go out and find these younger players that are up and coming. Why is it for so many years, we've kind of done it with the academy a little bit, but for so many years, we haven't identified really the next big talent. I know we as fans claim, oh, Garnacho's the next big thing. Watch out for him. He's world class. Oh, Martial's world class. Rashford's world class. Next big thing. Oh, no, none of these players have been our meal ticket. So what the hell are we talking about? But then we get beat up and down the league by teams who have gone out and scouted and recruited well for players on not that much money, both as a transfer fee and also their just weekly wages, right? They're able to go out and get players around the world that people maybe don't quite know about yet, right? And then their whole business model, and we'll get into this in a second, is to then sell up, right? You buy this player for 2 to 5 million, maybe 10 million, maybe you're going crazy, 10 million. Wow, woo. And then in 1, 2, 3 years, the Manchester Uniteds of the world come along and say, we'll pay 30, 40 million because we really like him, right? Like what would it be worth to you to take him off your hands? And that's the ballpark figure. We need to shift to that. And that's where I'm getting into this midterm here shortly of what that model is. But go out, replace the 11 I just mentioned with a brand new 11 of players that cost 5, 10, 15 million. We'll say generously 15 million on average. And I think even that's, I don't want to call it high, but I'm really discounting intentionally rumored players like Gyökeres, right? Where people are saying, no, let's go get Gyökeres. Maybe he's the one-off and the exception to this whole blueprint, of like being like a 70, $80 million ballpark player. Like that's an extreme. Okay, maybe you make the exception for him. But if we're saying 15 million, 11 times 15, quick math, 165 million, right? For those playing at home, we said we're, again, on average, selling everybody for 220 million. We're going to replace them for 165 million. That is a profit, if you will. Again, financial fair play, all of the book cooking, if you will, is it's more complicated than that. This is an oversimplification of how the process or the system works, but that is a profit of 55 million. There you go. Just saved you a little bit of money. Now, as we transition to this midterm, I think that needs to become our model, right? So now we're talking about buying the same type of player profile over a number of years and creating this churn of every 2 or 3 years, we're going out and buying roughly 165 million worth of players. And I would like to think, when not in a fire sale mode, maybe we're getting on average 30 to 40 million. That's probably a bit excessive. Let's say 30. Let's split the difference, 35. There we go. I think 40 is on the upper end when we look at what people have paid for McTominay, right? 20 million-ish. Let's say 35, right? Let's say there are some good rising stars. There are some that are around that 20, 25 million mark with, consistent success. So let's say 35 times 11, we're keeping that churn, 385 million, right? So now, every 3 years or so, 385 million, minus, again, replenishing them with that 165 million we talked about, it's a profit of 220 million, again. Not again. That's what we'd make, right, if you will, from the fire sale. That's where that figure came from. But now we see that 220 again in my rough estimation of how you flip these players. You buy them cheap, you make them into something with a solid system, with a solid structure at the club, right, with success. You flip them into that type of price tag. 220 million. There you go. 3 years. We'll divide that over 3 years, and that's 73 million a year. Not bad. And that's on top of everything else. And right, these are just players. And this isn't even taking into account player wages that we're saving on, right? You're not going to be paying $350,000 for a $5 million player. $350,000 per week for a $5 million transfer fee. Let me kind of clarify there. They're going to be on much, much less. So not only are you making a profit, if you will, by flipping players or right, selling the current crop, bringing in cheaper, and then flipping down the road, you're also saving on the weekly wages, which unlock other potentials around the club. So even by my estimate, those numbers are very conservative. And now when you're talking about the overall debt of the club, if we just, let me just quickly look at this. Manchester United debt. Let's see, what is it? Over 9. Okay, I was going to say about $1 billion, and that's about right, because that was the number that's sticking. About $1 billion is what we're saying. Cool, about $1 billion. So, if every 3 years you have the 220 million coming up, you have to do 5 cycles of that. So that is 15 years. That is quite a long time. But that's just kind of like break even. And that's still not taking into account sponsorship deals, right? Naming rights, things of that nature. Like there are definitely other ways to make revenue outside of just the playing staff. So you have to look at those and expect those to make up for that. So if in tandem you have these types of reductions as well as other improvements in business around the club, then you should be able to clear that debt, I'll say aggressively in 10 years. Maybe that's a conservative number, maybe it's an aggressive number. I don't know. I'm going to shave 5 years off just because I'm feeling generous. So let's say in about 10 years, we've cleared the debt and we're looking at a team that has reasonable success. I'm not expecting even to win the Premier League in those 10 years, and I'll say that right now. I'm even saying that Amorim needs 3 to 5 years for this project to come to fruition. I even said that with Erik ten Hag, and at year 3, we're getting rid of him. So it was still way too early, especially with how INEOS operates. So anyway, that is sort of then the midterm plan of how do we clear the debt. And I think this is a relatively viable method with the understanding from the fans that we will expect to be in the Europa League and the Champions League, and we still expect to compete. We don't necessarily expect to be title contenders every year, and winning it the majority of the time, right? I'm not saying that. I'm not saying we're going to be back in those 10 years, but I think that's a great way to get the club back on track. And of course, over that period of time, and this is sort of segueing into the long term, mid to long term, is that with that, INEOS should then be buying into their stake at the club a little bit more every year, right? Such that the majority that the Glazers have becomes a minority with an eventual buyout. And I know that was on the books, right? That's what they've been said or rumored to, but that's the current plan, if you will, is to eventually become the majority one day. But it's just kind of like a one day, like there's no real date on that. There's no real plan as to how that's being executed. So at least with this, you have a clear path as to how are we going to save money? How are we going to make money, more importantly? And how are we going to take that profit and turn it into majority ownership where the Glazers is no longer even a factor? Anyway, this has been a very long-winded, long video, and I'm a nobody. I don't have a following. So even if you watched it the whole way through, I really appreciate you. I hope you found some of my points valid. I think hopefully the blueprint makes sense to somebody out there. I think it's just the most financially responsible way to look at the situation. Again, it's a lot more complex and complicated than I make it out to be. There's an oversimplification in a lot of what I'm saying, but the premise is still there, right? Of that we need to become like a Brighton, if you will, where you buy cheap, you have great recruitment, you perform well and admirably, right? Like the style is there, the performances are there, maybe the results aren't always there, but you're very well respected, you're competing, right? I think that's just what we need to buckle down and do for a period of time until we can get the club cleaned up to where it needs to be, get the new stadium in, clear the debt, etc., and kind of rebrand or relaunch ourselves in a way in 10 to 15 years time. And I think this provides a pathway of doing so. So again, thank you for watching, and until next time, see you.